another episode of Pop Matters. I'm your host, Professor Lincoln Geraghty, and each month we'll be looking at popular culture matters and if they matter, from comics to sci-fi to all things fan-based. This month I have joining me Dr. Rebecca Janicker, Senior Lecturer in Film and Media.
Hello.
Dylan Pank, Senior Teaching Fellow and Course Leader for the BA in Media and Communication.
Hello there.
And Dr. Olly Gruner, Senior Lecturer in Visual Culture.
Hi there.
And in this episode, we'll be discussing the scientist in popular culture. Before we get on to our main topic of conversation, we'd like to start with a roundup of the last few weeks in pop culture news. Presenter privilege, I'll just start. We've got Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, coming out this week. It's supposed to sort of honour Chadwick Boseman's passing and obviously celebrate his successor, plus the first appearance of Namor, a character from the original comics. Everyone excited? Dylan, I know you're an MCU file.
Not so much. I have two teenage children now, so I was fully immersed in the MCU for many years. But I have to confess, they turned 12 and 14 at the time that we had the Avengers Endgame, so for me that was the perfect point to sort of jump off the MCU train. But I think, Black Panther, I think it's one of the more interesting entries in the MCU franchise. I think it has a lot more to say, I think, than a lot of the other films. So,
Oscar nominated and
indeed,
one of the most sort of successful, particularly.
And I think from a story point of view, dealing with the passing of the title character regarded is an interesting problem that they obviously dealt with in this one. So
yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how they move that on to a new stage in the storytelling.
Yeah, looking forward to another episode in the Wakanda story. Becky, Olly?
Yeah, I'm always keen to have a trip to see something on the big screen. It's always, wonderful to see something at the cinema, especially in these times. People going back into the cinemas, enjoying that experience, and I think that's going to be something that will get people there.
I agree with Becky. Very much looking forward to seeing it. I think Black Panther, it was, for me, a real landmark film as well. This, I think, still one of the top 20 grossing movies
Absolutely.
of all time, and featuring a black superhero.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess coming out at the time it did as well in 2018, in the heart of the sort of Trump era America, when white nationalism is, really on the rise, and the political significance of a film like Black Panther. I mean, I know there was a lot of discussion around the film and its representation of Africa, of the West's relationship with Africa, but the very fact that a superhero film of that kind of stature and of that kind of budget is exploring themes such as this, I think really important. As you say, a lot of the coverage of Wakanda's also been related to the passing of Chadwick Boseman, and I'm just really interested to see where they take the next film, really, in terms of narrative, in terms of story, in terms of themes, and whether it will have a similar resonance as it did back in 2018.
Absolutely, yeah. Another story we'd like to cover, we've just had Halloween, of course, and I wonder what your review of this year's Halloween offer has been, Becky. Film, TV, what stood out for you as the most horrific?
Well, at this time of year, of course, we think about, horror genre, we think about spooky things, gory things, and there's been some interesting things to see. On the big screen, I enjoyed Barbarian, which was a bit of a talking point for people. That kind of got people thinking about what works in a horror film, doing things in a different way, some real kind of shocking moments if you've seen that movie and perhaps you've been hearing about it.
No spoilers.
No spoilers. But it's not all about the big screen there. On the small screen, on streaming, I've been enjoying Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, which kind of harks back to that earlier format of the kind of anthology series in its way. Here's your kind of short burst stories. Some are quite kind of gory and shocking and building to a twist, and I quite enjoy that sort of thing. So, that's been fun. And we also have, speaking of the MCU, we have had a seasonal special with Werewolf by Night.
Yes, right. Yeah. Olly, are you a Halloween fan? Did you see anything particularly scary this season?
I'm a total weakling, to be honest, Lincoln, when it comes to Halloween and horror stuff. And I can't say I've watched anything that is immediately springing to mind of recent times. I mean, it was interesting to notice some of the sort of local film programmes and the revisiting of movies like Night of the Living Dead, which I do, you know, I still think is a really interesting horror and a classic from George Romero. And I think, you know, some of those films fascinating to return to. But in terms of, I'll be interested, Becky, to look at the cabinet of curiosities. I mean, Guillermo del Toro, I still recall with real interest films like Pan's Labyrinth, which kind of really, I guess, is a sort of a horror film of sorts, and exploring sort of themes and historical themes as well in really interesting ways. But perhaps. Not too much of recent.
Well, the oldies never go away. The classics,
absolutely,
you know, they stand the test of time, don't they? And any Halloween offerings this year?
Not for me. Much like Olly, I'm not really a horror aficionado. It wasn't my genre growing up. I was anything with a laser gun and a robot in it, I'd watch. But horror movies kind of missed me, I'm afraid. So.
Yeah. Well, along with horror and maybe another sort of horror show, we have. Netflix this week is streaming the 5th season of The Crown. I know, Olly, you're a secret fan of The Crown. What do you think we have in store with this phenomenally popular streaming series?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost feel like I'm going to be treading over already trodden ground. There's been so much coverage in the news of late with regard to The Crown. I believe it's now started streaming as of 8 a.m. this morning. We could start.
You didn't catch it?
I didn't manage to get. I was hoping I might be able to sneak a preview at sort of midnight last night, but unfortunately I didn't manage to get a look. I did see the trailer, and I mean, I suppose one of the big issues is it's focusing on quite a controversial decade in terms of the royal family. These are the years where Princess Diana is going to be taking a central role within the series, where the Queen's Annus Horribilis, as I think it's called, in 1992, where the Balmoral burns down or has a big fire, and various members of her family, I think, are getting divorced, and there's all these issues. Obviously, there's going to be coverage of Diana's kind of final years, and that notorious interview with Martin Bashir. I hear that's gonna. I presume this isn't too much spoiler in terms of it's kind of there anyway. But as we've seen, there's been a lot of controversy from public figures such as John Major, who appears in this series, and he's called it a barrel of nonsense. I think he's upset with how he's going to be portrayed.
You'd think, just to say, Johnny Lee Miller plays
John Major.
You'd think he'd be sort of chuffed at that
cool
kind of thing, wouldn't you?
Train spotting.
Or maybe not so chuffed, but you know, a young, hot, well, not so young maybe, but playing John Major, you would have thought you would have appreciated that casting.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think people have been saying no one's have actually seen exactly how So it is kind of based on some speculation about how his meeting with Prince Charles, and whether there's a sense that there's going to be a sort of conspiratorial trying to get the Queen to abdicate, and some of the story, discussions.
We've been warned that it's drama, you know. Yeah. We've got to have warnings just in case. Well, are you heeding those warnings, Dylan?
Not really, no. I'm just when I haven't watched all of it. I'm a season or so behind. But I think, as you're saying about the presentation, that is one of the great, I think, joys of the series. Really, is individuals who are so overexposed in terms of media, who are so familiar. Certainly, people of my generation are so familiar with these human beings as real people. The part of the joy is seeing how well particular well-known actors, like Johnny Lee Miller, and we've had in the past, we've had is it Imelda Staunton now is playing the Queen, and
Matt Smith is Philip.
Matt Smith in the past as well, and yes, of course, Lady Di, the various actresses performing as Lady Di, is seeing that performance, seeing almost like the technical process of seeing how a performer kind of embodies a character that we all know so well, because that's always the thing, when how do you balance creating a character that we're meant to identify with, empathize with, or in some cases, I think, as is likely to happen with at least one member of the kind of come to despise, I imagine. How an actor creates that character, as well as the judging themselves again, supposedly that it is history or things like that. So
Yeah.
I'm not really thinking about it so much as history or drama, but just enjoying the kind of performance. I think certainly watching Matt Smith, I think in the first series, I kind of felt it was like watching Jimi Hendrix play the Star Spangled Banner. It was like, it wasn't how it was supposed to be, but it was a great performance in its own right as Prince Philip. You know.
Absolutely. And you're a Doctor Who fan, but also a Crown fan, Becky. You've seen all the series up to date?
I have. So enthusiastic was I that I thought it was on a couple of days ago and I was disappointed.
That's true, yes.
But yeah, no, absolutely. Keen to see the new series. I think there's a lot to enjoy there, and as Olly and Dylan have been talking us through, now of course it feels very close to home, you know, territory that many people remember as not being that far away. Obviously the earlier seasons had that kind of cachet as well of being very historical, and there's a lot to enjoy in terms of, you know, the settings and the costumes, and those sorts of elements of the show are also very interesting and engaging. And I think actually, especially with a figure like Diana, you know, people will look at the costumes and they will remember the looks and kind of enjoy those cultural moments.
The iconic images from those times.
The imagery, yeah.
Well, from Netflix and the MCU to the sort of last story, Dylan,
Yes.
news on this sort of DCEU and what's happening with the Warner Brothers sort of world?
Yes, well, Warner Brothers is in a huge deal of chaos. It seems it's difficult to tell. There's been this big merger between Warner Brothers and Discovery, owners of the Discovery Channel. Warner Brothers has been sort of passed around a fair amount in the last couple of decades. It's been merged with Time Warner, or with Time Incorporated. It's been merged with AT&T, and now it's merged with the Discovery. And this has, again, there's been a lot of shake-ups at Warner Brothers, which obviously impacts the DC, both the brand and the trademark. Warner Brothers owns the DC superhero brand. And the big news this week, of course, was that they have appointed James Gunn and also another chap, Peter Safran, so as the heads of what they're currently labeling the DC Studios.
Okay.
So this is very explicitly their attempt, Warner Brothers' attempt to create a counterpiece to Disney's Marvel Studios as the sort of home, the full home of their superhero franchises, or at least some of them. It's not quite clear. And yes, the big attention-grabbing thing is that James Gunn, he of the Guardians of the Galaxy, and recently, because of various reasons, again looking back at certain social media-based cancellations, then moving to and from the Marvel universes to the DC universes, also the Suicide Squad and the Peacemaker TV show.
Yeah.
So he's a tremendously important figure in contemporary superhero media.
Yeah.
And he's been kind of, I would say, it's not quite equivalent, he's been, I suppose, appointed the Kevin Feige of the DC universe. But I think, yes, he's obviously, as we know him as a director and a writer, obviously very important, not only for the Guardians of the Galaxy, but also having involvement in the wider Avengers universe. But I think the figure to look at as well is the other character of Peter Safran, that people haven't talked about so much because he's not as glamorous a figure. He's actually a lawyer by training, that's his background. And he came through the world of talent management. So he comes from that sort of corporate background of the show business world, that he was someone who puts together deals, worries about contracts and things like that. And then he moved into production, but he, as a producer, he's worked with Warner Brothers before. He's also worked in the past with James Gunn, but he's also been quite important in the Conjuring franchise.
Oh, Conjuring.
So if we're
Horror
talking
links.
about universes and horror universes, he does actually have the Conjuring franchise, which started as a series of films, but now has in itself moved into a kind of self-contained multi-franchise universe.
Yeah.
So I think it'd be interesting to look at that balance, that they've appointed a kind of Kevin Feige equivalent, but it actually takes two people. It takes a creative, a writer, a director with experience within this, but also a sort of producer and a sort of corporate figure.
Yeah.
And that's very much aside from the Disney model, which has been very much to have Kevin Feige, or for the Star Wars universe, Kathleen Kennedy, sorry, just went there. Kathleen Kennedy is a kind of corporate figure who is overseeing all these various creatives.
Yeah.
But Warner Brothers, one thing that they did say, I can't remember exactly who it was, but they said this was their original plan, was to be very much director-led, like creative-led, that Zack Snyder was a key figure, Christopher Nolan was a key figure. The directors they've appointed in many cases have been sort of well-known directors to lead their franchises. And it's interesting to see that they've both appointed a director and a producer to sort of oversee the hopefully the shepherding to the next stage of the DC universe.
Potentially more. Superman, we've obviously had Black Adam in the cinemas recently, maybe more Batman, of course. And it's interesting, as you said, the links with horror and the horror franchise. But thanks for that, Dylan. That takes us nicely onto our topic of conversation today, the scientist in popular culture. Our panellists today have all done research on the scientist in popular culture, from representations of time travelers in science fiction to real-life NASA scientists on the Hollywood screen to the more shocking manifestations of mad science and TV horror. Rebecca has written and edited a collection of essays focusing on the prevalence of the scientist in our popular imagination. Her book, which I have a copy here, hot off the press, is called The Scientist in Popular Culture, Playing God and Working Wonders. And in this, published by Lexington Books, contains several essays that analyse diverse media representations and includes chapters by Rebecca, but also Dylan and Olly. So that's really what we want to talk about today. And I'll turn to Rebecca first as editor. Could you give us a sort of brief summary of the book, what it's really intended to sort of focus on, and some of the other chapters in there?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the book came out of my teaching, really, because for a number of years I've taught on a module where I'm very aware of established ideas about mad science and how engaging the figure of the scientist is and how we see them time and again in films and increasingly in TV shows and streaming as well. And I was very motivated by the idea that scientists kind of stand in for a lot of our hopes and fears, hence the subtitle, Playing God and Working Wonders. So I was very kind of rewarded with lots of interest from people suggesting some great ideas. Being that my research area is in horror, my mind kind of naturally has gone to the mad science kind of side of things, but other people were presenting me with much more kind of positive and well-rounded versions of what a scientist might represent. So what the book has what the book comprises now, it's kind of film and TV, so there's two parts to it. And we've got loads of engaging chapters on everything from kind of the Muppet Show to Dexter, so different kinds of genres, different kinds of audiences in mind, and fictional versions of real life scientists, complete fictional scientists, and drama series, different kinds of programs in there, and all really kind of digging into how scientists have kind of helped us think about how we relate to science over the 20th century, really.
Chapters in there, you mentioned the Muppets, so we're talking Honeydew and Beaker here, the classic scientists from the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
So are they positive representations of scientists?
Well, it's an interesting chapter, that. Yeah, I think it's hard to be too negative about them. There's a very interesting sense in there about ways in which the depiction of the scientist there really kind of taps into wider ideas about what's happening with TV culture at the time, post-war America, kind of move towards, improving one's lifestyle and commercialism and TV culture generally.
Okay. Yeah. And there's a chapter in there about Q from the Bond franchise.
There is.
Q as sort of scientist and inventor.
Some of the chapters, I mean, they're all, there's some great research out there on media and media science. There's a lot which kind of really takes a broad sweep. What I wanted the book to do was to give us some in-depth case studies, and that's what authors have done. And some of them are real kind of in-depth, others do a good sweep of, so Q is a good example because obviously the Bond franchise has been with us for decades, and a figure like Q can really help us see how attitudes towards science and scientists have changed over time, albeit in a somewhat, fictionalized version of real life that's represented by Bond. But
Usually Bond looks down on Q, but he
Well,
often comes up
changing
trumps
relationship.
and saves the day with
Yeah.
all those gadgets.
Yeah.
But your chapter's on something quite more horrific and gory, the sort of mad scientist in the TV horror series American Horror Story Asylum. Tell us a little bit more about that.
That's right. So being motivated by my interest in mad science, very engaged by the American Horror Story TV show, which has been running for sort of a decade plus now. That's a bit of a annual fixture. And right from the beginning, we had mad scientist characters in that show. And we can see them in the mold of Frankenstein and so on. And being, as people who watch that show will know, this kind of wider franchise TV series, some of the characters come back again, so this is an interesting thing. So we get scientists who are, inhabiting their particular spaces, and sometimes those spaces are revisited in later series, and we get a flavour of how the various activities that scientists engage with kind of impact on people's lives, really. So. Yeah.
And so the mad scientist is a sort of core trope in the sort of science fiction horror sort of field. But so too the sort of time traveller, and that's the chapter you and John Caro sort of co-wrote on the time traveller. Tell us a little bit about your chapter, Dylan.
Well, as is one of those examples, you see, it's more of a broad sweep. We're looking at time travel as a genre, which in our chapter covers not just films and TV, but also comic books and literature. And in many ways, it's quite a, compared to some of the other genres, even in science fiction, it's quite recent. We really look at time travel in the sense we understand it now. It's really only going back to the end of the 19th century as a genre. So it's a much younger genre, but we're looking at the way the scientist as a figure kind of interacts with a genre that does quite interesting things with narrative. One of the things we were looking at all the way through is how when you have time travel, a lot of the traditional cause and effect of narrative is changed around, you're inverted. So things that happen in the story can change things that have already happened, or things that have already happened maybe don't change things in other ways. But the other thing with time travel is there's different kinds of time travel in any time travel narrative. We broke it down to, mainly we discussed two, which I think we had it down as the kind of relativity idea of time travel, which is the sort of time as a flat circle, the kind of Terminator model, if you like, of it's all a loop, and whatever happens in the story is going to affect the outcome, so it's all predestined. Versus the sort of many worlds quantum theory, which I think is best expressed in something like Back to the Future, where you go back in time and you change and alter the future, and you have multiple possible outcomes and multiple possible universes. And we look at the way you have in early time travel narratives, usually in literature, so the work of Robert Heinlein, H.G. Wells. The scientist is a very central figure, is usually the hero of the narrative, and is able through literature to explain what's going on. They have to guide what kind of story you're in. What kind of narrative is this? Is this an open-ended many worlds narrative, or is this one where there's a loop? So the two examples I think are clearest of this are in Robert Heinlein's books, by his short story, by his bootstraps, and then later the film the story All You Zombies, which was made into a film called Predestination, where it's a very elaborate kind of, it's almost like a puzzle of how can all these story strands kind of tie together. How can you have these causal loops and bootstrap paradoxes, which anyone who's read a lot of science fiction and time travel especially will know about. And the job of the central character is to sort of guide the reader through that. But as you move to time travel in film, the scientist is less likely to be the hero because they can't narrate directly to the audience. And you see the rise of the sort of Doc Brown figure, the time-traveling scientist as the kind of aid, as sort of the donor or the mentor to the actual hero, Marty McFly, where often their job is to explain to the mentor the kind of story they're in. So we think of all those scenes of Doc Brown next to a whiteboard, literally drawing out, threads and patterns on a whiteboard to explain how the story works. And that's again a common sort of motif of those kind of shows and movies where, okay, how is this going to affect it? And someone will run up to a whiteboard or draw something on a piece of paper, I can't remember who it is, in Interstellar, for example, someone pokes a hole through a piece of paper to explain how wormholes work and stuff like that. So you have these characters.
Well, that's sort
world's
of
changing, yeah.
You know, the fictionalization of real science, isn't it? And Olly, you actually looked at the sort of representation of real scientists from the sort of 60s and 70s on screen. Tell us a little bit about your chapter and the importance of the scientist as hero figure.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it was interesting to hear Becky talk a little about science as both the sort of bringer of dreams and nightmares. And I think from the perspective of my chapter, often, though not always, as you say, Lincoln, the scientist was presented as a heroic figure and a figure very much tied into, I think, sort of wider political, social transformations of the period that I'm really kind of focusing on, which is the 1960s in America. And I began really with a focus on and became increasingly fascinated by the importance of science and technology to the 60s and an era that is oft celebrated, of course, for the sort of counterculture and the sort of social political movements of the time. But central to a lot of these wider transformations are science, technology. The space race obviously has a strong kind of pull, but NASA's role in society of the 60s and 70s. Some of the discussions that we still have today about the ethics of space travel. Should people like Jeff Bezos be blasting themselves into space when there's all these social problems on Earth, were very much part of sort of society's 60s politics and culture of the time. But the films I'm looking at are looking back on that era and as I say, really often focusing on the scientist as a heroic figure. I look at films like Hidden Figures, which tells the story of the African American women's contribution to the space race. And it was interesting, as I was writing, in fact, the chapter, the engineer Mary Jackson, NASA's headquarters was renamed after her in 2020. And this film offering a really interesting, I think, kind of hidden story of black women's contributions to a story that maybe, you know, previously had often been told in terms of sort of white male heroics and the astronauts and these sort of tales of daring do. I look at movies such as The Right Stuff, for example, which I find, you know, is a visual, spectacular, really, really interesting film in terms of visuals, in terms of a narrative, but that perhaps regurgitates a sort of a well-worn formula in terms of the story and the astronauts as the heroic kind of almost rebellious anti-establishment figures in terms of how they're presented. It was interesting to think about how science does become, and the scientist does become, so interwoven with wider political issues associated with the 60s. I took a look at The Shape of Water, and you have a science character, the Professor Hofstadter, who is, on the one hand, he's a very kind of complex, nuanced character. He's a scientist on the US side, but he also appears to be a spy for the Soviets at one point. I won't give away the sort of the narrative in terms of what happens as the story progresses, but there's a lot of back to in and fro in. But he is certainly presented, I would say, as a sympathetic character, and very much in comparison to the Strickland character in this film, who he appears as the vicious foil, who will not treat the strange creature that is at the heart of The Shape of Water in any way humane manner. So we have Hofstadter and Strickland as almost two sides of a 60s era conflict. I mean, Strickland's literally carrying a baton. I think he calls it the Alabama Howdy Do. So it's very difficult not to make that jump and connect that to early civil rights and so forth. But you know, throughout it's been a fascinating process to sort of look at some of these themes.
And it seems that dichotomy sort of really ties into the main theme of the book, as you said, Becky, the sort of the monstrous figure of the scientist, or the sort of god heroic figure of the scientist. What was it like editing chapters of colleagues? Everything go swimmingly well?
Very harmonious. Yeah, no, everyone was very good. There were, I think there were some fantastic ideas. And as I say, you know, when I started out with the project, I had a sense of the sorts of avenues down which I intended to go. And it immediately became obvious that people had such interesting and different ideas that I was really very glad to talk them through with people. Because that's the thing, you know, if you're with colleagues, of course you get to talk to them, and email conversations with folks further away, but yeah.
It just sort of broadens the scope of what chapters can be included.
No, brilliant ideas. Yeah.
Just want to plug it again. So this is The Scientist and Popular Culture. It's available on Amazon and all good bookstore retailers. And of course, using it in your teaching and you know, using it in your own sort of courses. So I'd like to thank you guys for coming along today and talking us through it. That's all we have time for today. If you have any questions about what we've been talking about, science and scientists in the media, pop them into the comment section below on the YouTube channel when this video gets posted. But for now, my thanks go to Dr. Rebecca Janicker.
Thank you.
Dylan Pank.
You're very welcome.
And Dr. Olly Gruner.
Thank you.
We've been discussing the scientist and popular culture because pop matters.